Hi, C15 from Nonlinear Labs puts to the test the question, how far can you take two simple sine wave oscillators? And the answer is, they can do this, and this, so quite far when you set them up to modulate their own or each other's phase, pass them through wave shapers, a comb filter, and all-pass and state variable filters, various feedback loops, and a few effects for good measure. C15 is a boutique synth with unconventional hardware controls and an elegant synth engine. In this video, I'll take an in-depth look at C15's synth engine, which is a combination of FM, West Coast, subtractive, physical modeling, and complex feedback systems all wrapped into one. I'll also take a look at the expressive ways you can control it, take a listen to quite a few of its presets, and, as usual, discuss the pros and cons. Before I start, a quick disclosure, C15 cost me substantially less than retail price, but as always, the company has no say over the content of this video. This channel is funded by the people who subscribe to my book updates and extra content on Patreon, YouTube Premium and ads, and affiliate links in the description, which help the channel regardless of the product you choose to buy. Okay, let's start with a hardware overview and then dig into the interesting aspects of the synth engine. The first impression when you unbox and start using C15 is that it's a premium instrument. The 5-octave keybed is excellent. It's made by Fatar with velocity sensitivity and mono aftertouch. These aren't weighted keys, but they have a premium feel and very pleasant to play. The overall build also seems very solid and pleasant. The enclosure is made of wood. C15 comes in two pieces, the base unit with keys, ribbons, a bender, and a few basic controls, and then a top control panel unit, which is easy to assemble and doesn't require any special tools. Takes under a minute to put this together. The synth lives in the main body and can function without the top panel, obviously without the direct parameter access, though it's actually programmable without the top panel using a web app over the built-in Wi-Fi hotspot. You can move the mounting brackets towards the center of the synth and place an iPad here instead of the panel if you like. In terms of expressive control beyond the keyboards, velocity, and aftertouch, you have two full-length touch ribbons and a pitch bender, and 4 expression pedal inputs in the back. You can program those pedals to access one of 6 macros. So for example, I've got a pedal under the table which you can't see, accessing this ribbon. You can program the pedals to be sustain pedals. So again, under the table, I can hold the note. And lift when I want. The ribbons can be in either one of 2 modes. Either absolute, in which case the entire length of the ribbon represents the possible values for a parameter or macro, which is useful when you want to quickly select a specific value. Or in relative mode, where no matter where you touch, the parameter changes relatively quickly, as opposed to requiring you to use the entire ribbon. You can also use MIDI CCs to control any one of the 8 hardware inputs. So to sum it up, there are 4 expression pedals, 2 ribbons, a bender, and aftertouch. All of those 8 inputs are funneled in through one of 6 macros, one or more of 6 macros, and then can be distributed to many of the parameters across the synth. While we're speaking about connectivity, C15 has 2 balanced audio outputs in the back, both XLR and 1/4 inch, a USB host jack for MIDI and firmware updates. Originally, C15 didn't support MIDI at all. Now it does through the host jack, which means you can connect it directly to a MIDI device like a KeyStep or other sequencer or controller. But if you want to connect it to an instrument with MIDI DIN jacks, you'll need to buy a USB MIDI host to 5-pin interface. And if you want to connect C15 to a computer, you'll need to buy the MIDI bridge from the company, this little thing, it has a magnet in the back. And once you attach it to the USB host jack, this becomes sort of like a USB device jack that you can connect to a computer. The C15 also has a headphone jack with separate volume control on the front where it should be. C15 is powered by an external adapter that comes included. By the way, there are no official CV inputs in the C15, but as long as you make sure to send between 0 to 5 volts, you can do that through the 4 expression inputs in the back. So that's it for the build and the expressive hardware controls. Let's take a look at the user interface. The interface is inspired by the synclavier. You choose the parameter you want to edit by pressing the button with a parameter name, and then you edit its value using this encoder. Optionally, you can switch into a mode where the ribbon controls the parameter value. This too works in relative or absolute modes. I prefer the relative mode. So for example, if we wanted this sine wave to modulate its own phase, we'd pick PM self and then edit the value using the encoder. Or the ribbon. So it's either a two-handed process if you want to edit things quickly. For example, if I wanted to add reverb, I could add mix, color, and size like this. Or use one hand and select a parameter and then edit it using the ribbon. So sort of like this. Speaking of which, most of the buttons represent more than one parameter. If there is a dot next to the parameter name, it controls one additional parameter. So for example, feedback mix and envelope C. And if there are 2 dots, then you can control 3 parameters by tapping this multiple times or by tapping this button. I've opened up the browser here so you can track what it looks like to use the web app. Again, multiple parameters. Like this, you can see that on the display. You can zoom in and out to this display. If you drag in between the lines here, and it can automatically follow the parameter that you're editing. And you can also edit the parameters here on screen. Almost all the important parameters are available on the Synth, so you don't need the web app, but it's certainly nice if you have an iPad or a computer nearby to have this, because you can see all the parameter values. It's something that would require you to press a button and look at the screen over here. On the iPad, by the way, the browser in Safari works a little bit faster than Chrome, but some features are available only on Chrome for some reason. There are a few advantages to using the browser. For example, it's easier to rename presets. There's also the MC view, which lets you use this XY pad to control the macros. If I get out of this mode, you'll be able to see it here. In general, I think it's faster to use the panel than the app, but if you have an iPad around or a computer, why not? The button labels, by the way, on these 4 panels live on these magnetic overlays, which are pretty easy to take off. So potentially if there's a major software update or if the engine is updated, then you can replace these and essentially potentially get a new synth, though the company hasn't announced plans for this as of yet. Okay, so that's how you control the synth. Let's talk about the meat of the synth engine. Overall, C15 is a bitimbral synth, meaning that you can play 2 different patches either in a split or in layers with a total of 24 voices of polyphony. As you browse through the presets and preset banks, if you see a preset with 2 horizontal lines, then it's a layered preset. And if you see a preset with 2 vertical lines, then it is a split. So for example, all these presets are splits. But let's get back to the basics and start with sine waves. So indeed, C15's signal path starts with just 2 simple sine wave oscillators. They've each got an envelope, they're fed into a mixer, and you can control their relative levels as well as pitch. By the way, a handy function is default, returns things to their default value. Let's just stick with one oscillator for now, oscillator A. Now things get interesting when you start applying different modulations or cross mods to them. Fluctuation is a simple parameter. It randomizes the pitch, eventually turning things into noise. Phase lets you set the on-start note phase. Makes things a bit clicky. Doesn't matter much unless you've got things with a different phase going on. Let's set that to the default. And then each oscillator has 3 phase modulation options. It could be modulated by itself, modulated by the other oscillator, and modulated by feedback, which is the audio coming in from the feedback mixer. More on that a bit later. Let's go back into here. PM self is basically like feedback on FM synths, gradually increasing the harmonics as the oscillator modulates itself, turning the waveform into a sawtooth, and eventually into noise. So that's a nice quick way to make a sawtooth wave. Being phase modulated by the other oscillator, again, very similar to FM synths. Phase modulation adds harmonics from oscillator B, and the timbres will change based on oscillator B's pitch. Sounds better on with octave intervals, but of course any interval works to keep things interesting. And again, that's how most FM synths work. And for PM feedback to work, we need to send audio through the feedback mixer. More on that in a bit. Let's get back to our default values, back to a sine wave, and talk about the shaper. Shapers have 3 core parameters: drive, fold, and asymmetry. Now for the shaper to be heard, we need to increase it in the mix of the oscillator and shaper. And then drive adds basic drive, crushing it, turning it into a square wave basically. And where things get more interesting is the folder introduces wave folding, goes along with drive, and then asymmetry shifts and can double the fundamental frequency. By the way, if you ever forget what a parameter does, just hit the info button and there's a really nice help for every single one of the parameters. Super useful. So if you don't know what level KT is, there's a nice description right here. So always useful if you forget what a parameter does. Feedback, by the way, the PM self is influenced by the shaper mix. So if we go back into PM self, it'll sound very different now. Unless we turn down the shaper in the mix. Continuing down the signal path, you've got the feedback mix. This is audio coming again back from the feedback mixer post the oscillator and shaper, as opposed to modulating the oscillator phase. And we'll get to this, I promise. And then there's a ring mod. And again, this depends on the pitch of oscillator B, because they're ring modded with each other. So, yet another way to get metallic sounds with ring mod. Let's set this to the default and ring mod as well. Next up in the signal chain, we've got the comb filter and the state variable filters. There's actually 2 of them. These are fed in parallel to the output mixer. So you can just feed in A and B if you like, without going through the comb filter and the state variable filter. Let's start with a state variable filter. So I'll go into A, reset that to default. So we now hear nothing, and increase the level of the state variable filter in the mixer. And we've got control over which of the 2 oscillators we want to feed in to the SVF, and we can also feed the comb filter into the state variable filter. So this is a 12 dB per octave dual SVF. So you've got control over, obviously, resonance, which sounds quite nice, but also the spread between the 2 SVFs. So basically a dual, so if you reduce levels just a bit, a dual filter here. And these dual filters are either low pass, band pass, and high pass. And remember, we can edit these parameters here as well. And you can have them routed in parallel or in series. Let's go, say, for parallel. basically to get form and sounds. And there's also a filter FM option. And you can choose the source between oscillator A and B, down to LFO rates, and all the way back up to audio rates. So that more or less is the state variable filter. Let's again reset its level to 0. Let's focus on the comb filter. The comb filter is probably the rarest element here compared to most synths made these days. Comb filters get their name from the way they impact the spectrum, resonating certain harmonics and reducing the level of others. But in effect, a comb filter is actually a very short delay circuit that self-oscillates and is tunable with MIDI notes. The comb filter also has a tunable all-pass filter in the feedback loop and a low-pass or high-cut filter in the feedback loop as well. So to get an impression of what this does, maybe for just a second, I'll reduce the level of the comb filter, go back and listen to oscillator A, and then maybe increase fluctuation, get it basically making noise with a lot of PM self or feedback, and maybe pitch it up. Anyway, let's get that level back down to 0, go back to the comb filter. What we're doing now is basically pinging the comb filter with noise, with a lot of frequencies, and letting it resonate. So we can control its pitch. Still sounds like noise, but as we increase decay, it starts getting a tone. And decay can also go into the negative territory, in which case it goes an octave down. Now we also have an all-pass filter and a low-pass filter in the loop. A low-pass filter is easy. It acts like a damper, changing the brightness of the sound. And the all-pass filter is where things get interesting. At 140 ST or a high note, it basically lets things go as they are. But as I reduce this, you can see sort of like the character or structure of what we're pinging change. And getting interesting tones out of this is a matter of balancing decay and the all-pass filter and damping. And obviously, what's exciting this resonator so for example, as I change the character of my noise, I'll get a different timbre, and yeah, everything else. So say if I go into some of the presets, let's go into say this bank. Yeah, it's definitely a physical modeling style sound. By the way, if we turn down the comb filter and just listen to what's exciting it, yeah, it's basically this. Let's take a look at one more preset maybe. Without decay. And with. Maybe this one. So saxophone-like sound. Again, no comb filter. And with and a bit of all pass. So we spoke about the comb filter, we spoke about the state variable filter, we talked about the output mixer. Output can be panned left or right for each of the different sources. Then there's another drive, or basically like another folder. That's per voice. With fold as well. And asymmetry, so another shaper here. So that's pretty cool. Let's maybe get this to the default values. Okay, let's talk about the feedback mixer. So this is yet another mixer, this time designed to send audio and modulation back into either the oscillators or the feedback mix. So for example, this is our sound. We can route audio into the feedback mixer. Let's maybe route the SVF into it. And it doesn't do anything unless we bring feedback into the mix. Let's say go into FB mix here. Okay. With feedback, without. And same goes for the phase modulation of the oscillators. I can take this audio output, bringing it back in to phase modulate, say, oscillator A. So with feedback, without. This preset is also a nice example. The core of the timbre here, aside from the attack, is basically feedback. So here we've got no feedback at all. And as we increase the SVF, you get this massive, basically feedback-based timbre. So that's the audio signal chain on a per voice basis. Then on a per timbre or split or layer basis, audio gets sent into the 5 effects. Got a basic sawtooth here. There's a flanger. And a bunch of parameters that we won't discuss here. So flanger, cabinet, drive, with the same shaper style parameters. So pretty nice cabinet, a gap filter, which is 2 more filters applied again to the entire timbre as opposed to on a per voice basis. Then echo, a delay. This can't be tempo synced, by the way. So that's the echo. And then the reverb. Let's increase the size. Remember, you can edit the parameters here. Mix. Along with a chorus option. So let's tone these down to default values, which is off. And let's take a quick look at modulation. You've got 3 envelopes. Unlike most synths where you can assign envelopes to different parameters, here the destinations of all 3 envelopes, envelope A, envelope B, and envelope C, are all predetermined. In terms of envelope shapes, they add a breakpoint to traditional ADSR, giving each envelope a 2-stage decay with a breakpoint in the middle, or a hold stage if you set the breakpoint to 100%. There's no graphic representation of the envelopes, which would have been nice, but you know the deal. Attack is how long it takes an envelope to reach peak level. Then decay is the time it takes it to get to the breakpoint, and there's a breakpoint level. Then decay 2 is a slope towards the sustain level. Then release is release once you lift your finger off the note. Then aside from that, you've got how velocity impacts level, and then key tracking both for level and for the overall envelope time. Envelope C is slightly different in that its breakpoint can go to a negative level as well as its sustain level, which is here. So that can go negative as well with envelope C. And then, like I mentioned, the destinations for the envelopes are preset. So for example, PM self can only be modulated by envelope A with its attack, and say we set this to lower, make this longer. So now envelope A is controlling both the level of oscillator A and its timbre. And the one exception to that is you can elevate the amp or the level envelope using the elevate parameter. So I can say keep the envelope up and high in terms of level and still get that initial phase modulation, attack and decay. So those are the envelopes. When you see more than one dot here, you'll typically get an envelope to modulate that parameter. For example, here, typically envelope A is related to oscillator and shapers A, except for the phase modulation from B, which is tied to envelope B. And then envelope C handles pretty much everything else, as well as is sprinkled here and there, for example, in fluctuation. So those are the envelopes. They can't loop. There's no LFO, like I mentioned earlier. Let's talk a bit about the 6 macros. Like I mentioned in the beginning of this video, these are conduits for the different expression and hardware controllers into multiple parameters. These you can assign as you wish, the macros. Let's go back to a sine wave, and let's say that I wanted to assign a macro to PM self. So there are 2 ways to do that. Either choose a macro here, choose basically one of the 6 macros, A through F, and I could also assign a macro by holding, say, macro, let's choose B, and then pressing this parameter that makes the assignment directly, and then I could just choose the macro mod depth, and you see it very nicely here, and on screen, by the way, as well. And then step 2 would be to choose what hardware controls macro B. Obviously, it would have been nicer if this had been on the same screen, but anyway, you choose using hardware select. So let's say I choose Ribn 2. I want that to control macro B, and I now have Ribn control over the PM self parameter. Now, as you can see, it's much easier to assign these things using this grid. So which hardware source goes into which macro destination. Now, like I mentioned earlier, while C15 doesn't have any 5-pin MIDI DIN inputs or outputs, you can connect USB MIDI devices to it, such as external controllers, and you can use a computer as a hub for Bluetooth and USB devices sending MIDI using the bridge. Now, there's no support for MPE or polyphonic aftertouch. I'm told that's a consideration, but there are quite a few interesting MIDI hacks that you can do to enhance them. One of them, for example, is connecting this to something like the KeyStep 37, which I have over here to the side. So obviously playing this with an external instrument isn't that interesting. However, this has a few modes that can enhance C15, even if it's just to the side somewhere. It's recommended that you turn local off for this so we don't get a feedback loop. Anyway, now I'm basically going through the KeyStep, and this can do a few things for us. For example, enable a chord mode, octaves in this case, or maybe sus chords. So nice chord mode, and you can see the LEDs light up here. I could also get an arpeggiator going here and just set it aside. And we now have a built-in arpeggiator for C15 and mess around with the parameters as we like to do when we have an arpeggiator going. That works pretty seamlessly with chord mode here as well if I wanted. So cool stuff. I was controlling KeyStep off screen, and you can use the sequencer, chord mode, and strum mode as well on that. Obviously, it's not just limited to KeyStep. You can use any MIDI effects machine or sequencer that just has quite a few of them. Another interesting expression companion is this Genki Wave ring. I've set it up to control the ribbon A by rolling my hand and ribbon B by tilting my hand. Now, these obviously can control multiple parameters. But cool way to get expression as you play. And then final MIDI hack is to get an LFO, so you can create a PWM-like effect by using a manual LFO, your hand. These, by the way, are two oscillators that are phase shifted, giving you a sort of PWM sound. Anyway, doing this manually makes you really wish for an LFO. Now, what I did here was connect this app, it's Ribn by Once Upon a Synth, and that's connected via Bluetooth to my computer and routed using Bohm's MIDI translator through the USB jack in the back. So basically, I can now control the PWM with this and just let this loop and get an LFO via MIDI, and we now have both PWM and an LFO. You could also use a Digitact to get this kind of LFO or any other MIDI sequencer that can modulate CCs. It's a workaround, but there's your LFO. Now, just so that I don't get a comment, you can use the oscillators when they're pitched really low as a type of LFO for certain destinations that the oscillators can be mapped to. Before I head out to the pros and cons, I wanted to highlight a few miscellaneous features that aren't related to the synth engine, but are quite cool just in terms of the user interface. The first is, as I scroll through the presets, notice how these LEDs are lighting up. And what this shows you is all the signal flow and macro parameters that aren't set to 0. So for example, you can tell that in this preset, these 4 macros are active, there's feedback going on, oscillator A, and these are active. Nice quick way to very quickly see what's going on a per preset basis. And you get similar destination indications from the macros in the envelope. So say macro A in this case points to feedback mix, then macro B, I guess doesn't do much here. D, typically the expression pedal, goes into release. So as you press the expression or sustain pedal on input 4, it will increase release. And same goes for the envelopes. Once you press an envelope, if it has an active destination, then that'll blink. A few more interesting things: as you change parameters in a preset, they'll get highlighted. So say, for example, I know that these aren't the preset defaults. If you hold Shift, it'll show you the preset default value. And if you hold Shift while you're in preset mode, it'll show you which parameters you changed. There are multiple levels of undo, which is always nice. And then finally, the synth is constantly recording everything you play in the background. So if you go into the recorder, you can view it all. There's quite a lot here, all lossless, and download that to your iPad or computer if you want. Okay, I'll play you a bunch of presets at the end of this video. Meanwhile, let's take a look at the pros and cons of C15. On the pros side, let's start with a synth engine. It's refreshing to see an engine that isn't just a copy or clone or recycle of an old idea, but rather takes a stand. This isn't another multi-operator FM synth. This isn't a standard oscillator to filter subtractive synth. Rather, while it does rely on principles that exist, obviously, it's a carefully curated set of 4 core components. Only 2 cross-modulating oscillator/shapers, a comb filter, and a couple of state variable filters with a heck of a lot of feedback, but it's organized in a way that can create an extremely broad range of timbres, from electronic pianos to brassy strings through percussive physical modeling-based instruments and evolving pads. The effects are an excellent addition on top that truly come together with a core sound engine's capabilities, especially since you can feed them back through the feedback mixer, and with splits and layers, you basically get 2 of everything, which is quite a bit of sound design to play with. Now, sure, it would have been better if it had 96 knobs instead of this 2-step process of selecting a parameter and then editing it using the encoder or the touch strip, but I imagine that would have made things even more expensive than they are as is. Now, while I can't say that with all the internal cross mods, feedback, and over 200 parameters that the synth engine is super easy to understand, but with a little bit of help using the info button and the LED hints I mentioned earlier, there's no need to reference the manual, and it's fun to explore and discover as you go. Now, the C15 was designed as a player's synth, meaning that it's designed to be played and occasionally use the ribbons, as well as 2 or more pedals using your feet, but certainly no arpeggiator and no sequencer, aside from the hack that I showed you earlier. But if you're into twiddling knobs, you should know that there's none of that built in. Speaking of cons, obviously, probably the first thing that comes to mind is the cost, as things are with boutique synths that are handmade in Europe in small quantities. 4,000 euros is not an easy purchase decision by any means for most people, even though to their credit they have a rent-to-own plan, which might make the price easier to swallow, but it's still a lot to pay. I think it would be nice if at some point Nonlinear Labs were to come out with a mini version of the synth, perhaps without the ribbons, and a more condensed interface, kind of like HydraSynth Explorer, where you select a module and then edit its parameters using encoders and mini screens. I just think it would be great if this synth in hardware form would be more accessible to a larger number of people, because it's super interesting. By the way, if you're interested in just the synth engine and not the physical controls of a synth, check out the software synth Contour. This was developed as a collaboration between Nonlinear Labs and Native Instruments, and even though C15 is more advanced in several ways, the core functionality is very similar. I tried it and it sounds really great in my opinion, and captures the essence of this sound quite well. Other cons are that the sound engine doesn't have any LFOs or looping envelopes. That's an intentional omission, as the design philosophy is one where you're expected to use the hardware inputs to generate modulation using pedals, ribbons, the bender, aftertouch. But still, I can't see how adding an LFO or 2 would have taken away from this. Hopefully, we'll see that in the future as a mod source for the macros. Custom LFOs already exist in Contour, so I can't imagine it would be too hard to add them here. I already mentioned earlier the envelopes have specific destinations, so if you're used to assigning an envelope to anywhere you want, you'll need to study how this works and learn what can be assigned to what. So bottom line, this is an extremely well thought out synth. If you're bored with the same old synth signal paths and components, I think that C15 brings a fresh, interesting, and fun approach to synthesis and performance. The multiple internal feedback option is a great source for happy accidents or very noisy ones. Obviously, the price isn't for everyone, but at the very least, I highly recommend you check out the demo version of Contour from Native Instruments. And if you're at a loss for sound design ideas, tips, and tricks, check out my ever-expanding book, available to the good people who support this channel on Patreon. Hit like if this was useful. Don't forget to ring the YouTube bell if you want to make sure you don't miss the next one. Thanks for watching.